Okay, great. So thank you again. Good evening for joining us for our third webinar entitled Writing a Commentary of Perspective and Opportunity to Publish for Medical Students and Residents. We have three distinguished speakers this evening who will be joining us to share their own experiences in writing commentaries and perspectives. And we'll lead with Dr. Arno Kumagai, who's Professor and Vice Chair of Education for the Department of Medicine at University of Toronto, Toronto, Canada. He also serves on the editorial board of Academic Medicine, and we've had the chance to work together, and I'm grateful and excited that he's here joining us. And special thanks to medical student Lama Nuruddin, who is one of the BNGAP fellows and who has worked hard to bring us together for this webinar this evening. So as mentioned, and I've mentioned this before, the mission of BNGAP is to help diverse medical students and residents become aware of academic medicine as a career option and to provide them with the resources to further explore and potentially embark on an academic medicine career. So the reason, just to contextualize why we've been offering these webinars, and this may be a little bit repetitive to those who have joined us in the prior meetings, as many of you know, there's been an explosion in the growth of allopathic medical schools across the country, with probably 10 to 14 new schools opening up in the next decade or so. And what that means is that there's a great need to recruit many of you, when I say many of you, are current medical students and residents, to become future faculty. We know that diversifying the academic medicine workforce has been a huge issue. And when I say diversifying the academic medicine workforce, still there's not good parity by gender in terms of having a good number or an equal number of women serving as our faculty. And similarly, there is a low proportion of underrepresented racial ethnic minorities who serve as faculty, specifically Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans. We also know that something has been occurring prior to medical school and even during medical school, where underrepresented racial and ethnic minorities are less interested in becoming future faculty. And that disinterest continues during residency. So in this next slide, this is a group of faculty and students who have worked collaboratively to develop curriculum to encourage more diverse medical students and residents to become future faculty. And I just want to highlight this because this is what we're hoping what the future phases of academic medicine will look like moving forward. And this is something that we're aiming for. Just to provide you with the references and examples of what this collection of 40 students, residents, and faculty have developed. And this is really modules within Medit portal to complement what we're going to be talking today about. So these modules, you should review them, look at them if you're thinking about how to build a foundation for a future academic medicine career. This webinar is particularly poignant as you think about a future career in academic medicine because publishing in a peer-reviewed journal is capital. It's an important foundational element to building a future academic medicine career. And as featured in an article by Dr. Jeffy and Dr. Andrial, publishing during medical school especially is an important mediator to increasing the number of URM faculty down the line. So I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Nuruddin, who will give us a synopsis of who you all are who registered for this webinar.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Lama Nuruddin. I'm one of the fourth-year medical students here over at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. I would like to thank you so much for everyone who has registered and who has joined us today for this wonderful webinar. We expect a very informative talk, and we look forward to hearing the perspective of our speakers. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of who you are, who are the fellow participants on this webinar. So most of us, 80% of you are actually either interested or very interested in academic career, and 3/4 of the participants are medical students, 60% of residents or fellows. We can also see that more than half of us are women, and there is a relatively good diversity and representation with regards to the participants in this meeting. With that being said, there's 2% American or Indian and Alaska Natives, 31% Hispanics, 19% Blacks, 19% Asians, and 35% white or Caucasian. With regards to members of the LGBTQ community or sexual and gender minority, what we call SGM, 18% of the participants have identified as being members of the SGM. And then we just wanted to know a little bit more about where you are in terms of your exposure to the different types of publications that there are. And the majority of the participants actually are not familiar with either MedEd Portal or Academic Medicine as a journal. So we hope that this webinar is going to be able to inform you more about these two wonderful tools that we have in the world of academic medicine. But then when we asked you further about the types of publications that you have been exposed to or either published, most of you were actually most familiar with original research, and that's to be expected because these are the types of articles that we are pushed to publish in medical school and to cite in our papers and presentations and poster presentations. So there were more than 40% of us who have actually published in their original research. However, what's really great about this is only 3% of the participants have published perspective or commentaries, and more than 80%, actually 87%, were not familiar with what a perspective or commentary piece is. So we hope that this webinar is going to be informative and introduce you to what it is, and hopefully you will be able to gain the skills to publish them yourself. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Arna Kumagai. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Dr. Kumagai is a professor and vice chair of education in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto in Canada. He also serves as a member of the editorial board of the Academic Medicine. He's worked extremely hard in this webinar with us through some pretty tough circumstances. So thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado,
thank you.
I turn the floor to you. Whenever you want us to advance your slides, just let us know. We can do that from here.
That would be great. So I guess there was an interruption in the connection, but I see that's my title slide. So advancing it to industry relationship disclosures, figured out a way of making any money off of what I do, so I have no disclosures to declare at this time. I'd also like to acknowledge Mary Beth DeVilbiss, who is the managing editor of Academic Medicine, as well as Jennifer Campi, who is editorial staff, and particularly the editor-in-chief, David Sklar, who is really a visionary and guiding force behind the journal. And Dr. Sanchez is also a member of the editorial board, so please, JP, if you have things to say, just please jump in. Next slide, please. So the question that they've asked me to talk about is this idea that, we want to get more and more people publishing, and particularly I think it's important publishing in the type of publishing I'm going to talk about tonight is really actually very, very important, particularly for students from historically marginalized or underrepresented groups. And the reason why is it's because it gives a perspective of things that normally academic medicine doesn't do. And I think many of us over the years have really tried to put a crowbar into gaps in academic medicine in general, in Academic Medicine, the journal, to really open up openings and opportunities to have these visions and these opinions expressed. Next slide, please. So this all goes back to the idea of learning and scholarship, and the that it is important to articulate a vision, but it needs to be a vision that is really grounded in particularly important theoretical approaches. Next slide. So the learning objectives of this session, first is to identify requirements for submissions for perspectives or invited commentaries in academic medicine. To identify characteristics of successful submissions, to consider how faculty mentorship can contribute to this goal, and finally, I think there should be a fourth. Next, could we advance? Oh, and identifying opportunities to submitting and publishing learner scholarship. So this is a specific focus. I was asked to do this as part of the editorial board, a specific focus on academic medicine, but I think what we're going to be talking about applies to journals in medical education in particular, in general. Next slide, please. So in terms of peer-reviewed content, academic medicine has different forms of approaching this. One is MedEd Portal, and I know that you've had a session on this before. So this is a way of publishing essentially curricula that can be used by other institutions and materials for learning activities. There's also commentaries and perspectives, and I'll be commenting on the latter two tonight. Commentaries are specific pieces that are invited by the editor-in-chief, and they're usually, oh, you can advance the next slide, please. They're invited by the editor-in-chief, and they're comments on a specific article or on a theme of a specific issue. So to give you an example, there could be an article on, an article on learning assessment, and they could get a person who's known for learning assessment to comment on that particular study. On the other hand, you could have a topical reference, like the one that I'm listing here by Rita Sharon, is just a commemoration of a particular, I think it was medicine and arts issue. So it was bringing in a very well-known person to talk about this, but these are by invitation. They could be one or two authors involved, and the authors are usually fairly well-known in the field. These are, so in terms of student publications, I think this is less so, but you could occasionally see commentaries where the editor-in-chief has reached out to student or student groups to write commentaries, and that would be great if you could do that. And I would encourage I'd be happy to encourage the editor to do that. Perspectives are really what we're going to focus in on tonight. Perspectives are pieces that are from 2,000 to 3,000 words. Oh, you can advance to the next slide, please. In academic medicine, it's a 3,000 word maximum. These are essays, they're not studies. And as Dr. Sanchez had mentioned, or Lama had mentioned, that these aren't, so this isn't like case-controlled randomized clinical trials, okay, or trials of educational interventions. These are much more like, they're opinion pieces. And they're on a timely topic of interest to medical trainees, so medical students, residents, fellows, educators, and administrators. So kind of a hot topic in medical education. Next slide, please. So there are a bunch of possible topics that one can choose from, things like assessment of learning, competency-based medical education, curricular design, issues of diversity and inclusion in medicine and medical education, career or workforce issues, national or that's supposed to be international issues, and for instance, like immigration or global education, things like medical school residency and residency selection, or issues of learner climate and mistreatment. And that's become a very hot topic in medical education these days. So I asked the the academic medicine editorial staff just to send me some sample titles of highly read papers that they've received recently. So you can see here's just just 5 samples basically. It is time for zero tolerance in sexual harassment in academic medicine, teaching the social determinants of health, a path to equity or a bridge to nowhere, the survey checklist manifesto, who am I, who do I strive to be, applying theory of self-conscious emotions in medical education, or framework in integrating implicit bias recognition in health professions education. So you can see that it's not just kind of the nuts and bolts of teaching medical students, but it's talking about things in a much broader way. That is dealing with societal issues that may come up in medical education, or the impact of recruitment of, for instance, underrepresented minority students or women in the, on the healthcare workforce. So a lot of these different things would be considered fairly timely topics and have attracted a lot of attention in recent years. There are student perspectives, and there have been a number of them published. And I think Jennifer Tsai, I believe Jennifer's on the speakers list tonight. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Great. Okay, so I will not, I won't comment on this, but it is a really brilliant perspective piece that she's written. And again, it involves looking at issues of race and education, which could be of huge importance in terms of how we train physicians to practice with equity. Next, so if you go to the next slide, it's new academic medicine, new conversations. So David Sklar, the editor-in-chief of Academic Medicine, started a recruitment of papers around specific themes, started this several years ago. Last year, there was a call for papers on social justice and issues of equity. And it wasn't so much, this wasn't meant to be papers that were grouped around a single issue, but it was basically saying we want to see more published in this area. And the editorial board has received a large number of papers in this area. The call is closed, but that doesn't mean that they've stopped accepting papers in social justice. I can say that there are a number of people on the editorial board, including Dr. Sanchez and Dr. Sklar, definitely myself, a lot of people who have a really strong interest in this area. And it's something that I think we're very much interested in recruiting, particularly student perspectives on. So just because this new conversations call is closed now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't submit. You definitely should submit in this topic. But the current one that was just actually launched last week for 2018-19 is to a call for papers addressing the issue of trust in medicine. So we talk about, we talk about cultivating patients' trust. We talk about entrustable activities and all of these things, and that's one way of kind of approaching it. Picking a topic is another subject. So how do you, as a medical student, sit down and decide what you would like to write on that might have a chance of getting published? And it really is a balancing act between what might be of interest generally to the general field of medical education, but also what ability you have to present a really unique and compelling vision to that. So in this next slide, it's meant to be a balance between the two, general interest and one's own vision, and how you can contribute to this discussion by contributing a particular, very unique perspective. But above all, I think the one thing that is absolutely clear is that it's important when you're selecting a topic to select something that you're passionate about, so that you can write in a way that is very compelling and convincing. Okay, but all that said, perspective pieces are not opinion pieces. Okay, they're not rants. They can be polemic. There's no problem with that. But it needs to be a very, very carefully crafted, well-reasoned, well-cited academic piece. So advancing to the next slide, ways to kind of decide on what to pick. Look for things like what has been written on the subject, which journals would be best to submit, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Within a given journal, for instance, like Academic Medicine, what do the writing of recent pieces look like? So for instance, if you're going to write, you want to write a perspectives piece, go through the journal for the last 6 months and just kind of get a sense of what was written on what subjects, and also the type of writing, the flow of writing, because it is a very different thing that you would write if you were writing, say, a biomedical piece or a piece describing, say, clinical studies or outcomes research or basic science. Okay, it's a very different type of writing. So also, which authors may be open to your ideas? This is something that a lot of people don't think about, but if you have authors that have really resonated with you and you're writing a piece that may elaborate on their work or may in some ways you think complement their work, then keep them in mind, because many journals, including Academic Medicine, gives you the opportunity to suggest referees. Okay, so that means that when you submit the manuscript, the editors look it over, and then we'll send it to either members of the editorial board or outside reviewers who have expertise on the subject. Okay, and you can actually list, I believe for academic medicine, it's 4 authors. That's not to say that they're going to pick all of them or any of them, but the very fact that you're listing people increases the chances that you will have somebody who will read it who might understand it. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to automatically give it a favorable review, right? It just means that they'll be able to, they know enough about the field that they'll be able to give the piece a fair reading. And that's very important. It's also very important to consider issues of conflicts of interest, right? You don't want to end up sending it to your spouse or your best friend or something like that. It's got to be, it has to be rigorous in terms of the review itself. So advancing the next slide. The other thing I wanted to do when we're talking about publications and where you could possibly publish is to introduce you to JANE, okay? JANE stands for Journal Author Name Estimator, jane.biosemantics.org. It's on the slide itself. Now, a friend of mine who is now one of the editors of JAMA introduced me to JANE a while back. So if you just Google JANE, you'll find this. But basically, JANE is actually really helpful because you can take the title of an article you're planning on writing, the abstract, or even the entire piece, and you could paste it into this window. And underneath, if you look, it says find journals, find articles, find authors, or find articles. And if you click on that, it will give a listing of journals that have similar themes, okay? And there's a list, and it's ordered in the preference of it's ordered in terms of what this program considers relevant. Now you have to be careful, and you have to use it with a certain grade of salt because it's not always accurate. But the one thing it does do is it lists the journals, and then if you click on it says show articles, and if you click on the window, it'll give you examples of maybe 3 or 4 articles from that journal that have common themes. They do it, I think the program does it by a word search, right? And then you can look at those articles and you can look at the authors. So some of it gets very interesting. I mean, I've done this with pieces from either students or my own work, and oftentimes I see my name there, or I'll see collaborators, or I'll see people whose work I really follow closely listed as authors on it. So, but this is just one way of doing it. It's not foolproof. You know, it's best to be able to do it with additional work. That is to go to the journals and look at them and to look at the articles. But oftentimes that can be very helpful. Next slide, please. Let's see, can we see the next slide?
Yes, it's alive, unfortunately.
What's that?
It is up, but there is lag between advancing the slide and what's showing up on your screen. So as soon as you say next slide, it's actually being advanced, so you can go ahead. Super.
So this slide is the importance of titles and abstracts. I actually received this directly from the editorial team in academic medicine. Titles and abstracts are very important because, right, the indexing services that'll look up particular commonly used search terms to get a sense of what wording people are using, but also, more importantly, titles make a great first impression. So readers oftentimes make a decision based on the title and the abstract, and they may not read the rest of it, okay? So to have something that's compelling, that's interesting, that kind of draws attention is very important. Next slide, please. That said, okay, titles are important, and it's important to be compelling, but you don't want to be clear off in left field. You don't want it silly, or else the readers, but more importantly, in some ways, the reviewers won't take it seriously enough, and they'll downgrade their rating on it and make the chance of getting it published less likely. So you want to have something that, again, is compelling, but not so off the wall that it seems a little ridiculous. Next slide, please. Okay, so at the risk of making myself sound a little bit silly, just for the sake of convenience, I came up with, I put a list of some recent perspective pieces that I've written along with co-authors, just to give you a sense of what kind of examples of titles. So beyond cultural competence, critical consciousness, social justice, and multicultural education, active interpretation of philosophical approach to the introduction of creative arts and medical education, making strange, a role for humanities and medical education, Freddie Gray's social inequities and education for social justice, and another one, cutting close to the bone, medical student trauma, free speech, and institutional responsibility in medical education. So these are meant, I mean, these ideas, the titles of these, when we created them, really spoke, they resonated with me. And I was hoping in titling the papers this way that it would be compelling enough so people would say, gee, that, you know, what does making strange mean? That's a really weird term. You know, oh, it has to do with art. So I'm actually interested in humanities and art. So maybe I should look into this more. So that's really kind of what I meant by having titles that, you know, you try to be compelling and grabbing, but not silly. Next slide, please. So the writing, next slide.
Yes, it's up.
Okay. So the writing, again, should be compelling. Oops, I have to wait for my slide to advance then. So the writing should be clear and comprehensible to a general audience. Okay, so that's really important because you're dealing not only with people who are clinicians and even basic scientists, but you're also dealing with educators, you're dealing with administrators, so it has to be fairly broad. That said, so trying to avoid really specialized terminology, or if you're using abbreviations, making sure that they're well defined is important. However, don't be afraid to use important words that define really complex concepts, such as, you know, even the word epistemology. That scares a lot of people, but it means something in very specific context. Or the word privilege, or more loaded terms like the word racism or homophobia. We've oftentimes been afraid to use those words in medicine because they're so scary. Okay. So above all, next slide, please. Just keep your eye on the target. In other words, be clear to yourself on exactly what you need to convey. You know, I believe I'm really, because of all the technical issues of going over time. So let me just cut to the chase. If we can advance a couple slides to key to success. Mm-hmm. So just two final points. One word, the key to success, get used to rejection. Okay, you'll send papers in and they're going to be rejected and they'll be full of criticism and you'll feel terrible. You'll feel like nobody cares, that you're washed up, you should go do something else for a living. But rejection is part of it, okay? And the more you accept that and the more you learn from it, the more successful you'll be. Believe me, I've had some papers I've had rejected from 5 and 6 journals before they were accepted. You know, and start out with the most, you know, my first major piece, I actually wrote up, I took to one of my supervisors, and she took one glance at it and said, that's silly, don't even bother submitting it. And, you know, against my own judgment, I went ahead and submitted it anyway, and it was the first major piece that I had accepted, and a companion piece that was part of the original was accepted the next year, and that really kind of launched my career in this area. So, in other words, as Samuel Beckett says, you know, fail once, try once, fail once, try again, fail better. And that's very much a part of this, okay? Mentorship is incredibly, so this is the next slide, final essential ingredient. Mentorship is incredibly important. Finding the right mentor who can really help guide you through this process is incredibly important. So things to remember if you're just waking up, this on the last slide. Picking the right theme is a balance between general interest and your unique perspectives. Picking a theme that you're passionate about is also important. Choosing the right title, that goes a long way in making your work compelling. Reasoning should be rigorous. Citation should as well, right? The writing should be clear, compelling, and convincing. And the idea should cite important literature. Also, the one thing is that in medical education, we tend to stay within academic medicine. We tend to stay within our own group. But don't be afraid to reach out to educational literature, sociology, anthropology, political science. I do a lot of philosophy in my own work. So reach out, because those ideas are very important, and bringing them in a way that can enrich the field can be very, very critical. And finally, again, think about finding a good mentor. Ask people you know who do a lot of writing. Ask them if they know people who do writing, particularly in this area, okay? Particularly this type of commentary, I think is really critical. So thanks. I'm sorry if we've gone over because of technical issues. If you have any questions, there's my email address. I'll turn it back over to Lama and Dr. Sanchez. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumagai, for your wonderful talk, and it was really eye-opening and inspiring. So we thank you so much for your time and effort. If you could please stay on the phone until the end of the webinar so that you may answer any additional questions that are posed by the audience. So for now, we will.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. So now we will turn it over to our trainees, resident and student. So we have two very distinguished speakers tonight. The first is a PGY2 in internal medicine, Dr. Jesse Burke-Raffel. He will be talking about his experience in writing his piece. And then followed by Dr. Burke-Raffel is Ms. Jennifer Sai, who is a fourth-year medical student at Brown University, who will also be talking about her experience in writing her piece. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Dr. Burke-Raffel.
Thanks, Lama, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Well, I just want to give a plug for Dr. Kumagai. I actually knew Dr. Kumagai at University of Michigan. We shared some time there, and he's a very big deal in the field of medical humanities and social justice and equity. So you guys should listen to everything he says.
Oh, thank you.
I actually didn't see his slides before, but I think there will be some good parallels and overlap. If you go to the next slide, please, Lana. So I'm gonna keep it brief. We wrote a piece in academic medicine. 3 students at that time, myself, Logan Jones, who worked at a very high level in the AMA student side, and then Janice Farlow, who was on the board of trustees, I believe, in AAMC. We had all served on different kind of boards and wanted to write, started with this idea, we wanted to write a piece about how academic medicine, and particularly the medical education journals, can engage students and residents, that is learners, in the scholarly process, how we can kind of do what you guys are doing right here, for those of you joining the webinar. And this is the piece that came out of it. It's an invited commentary, and how I got invited is I was at a conference where David Sklar, the editor-in-chief of Academic Medicine, was talking, giving a presentation, and to be honest, I approached him after the talk, and I pitched my idea, and he said, you know what, we've got these letters that we had requested coming out in the journal very soon. Can you get me an article in 2 weeks? No guarantees, but we'll take a look at it. And I said, thanks a lot for the consideration. I'll get it to you. And that's where this started, and we were able to put something that was scholarly and hopefully good together, and it was accepted. I would echo what Dr. Kumagai said. I really think perspectives are a great place to start, because they don't need to be invited, but certainly you can always reach out to someone and say, hey, I've got a pitch. Is this something that you would consider as an invited commentary? So I just want to plug that. So I'm just going to cover a few points related to this piece. So where to start? So I think Dr. Kumagai hit it well. You got to start with something you're passionate about. If you're not passionate about it, it's going to be a terrible piece. So something you're passionate about, something you can write sincerely about. I'm a white guy from Seattle. I can't really sincerely write about, my perspective on race issues from, an African-American's perspective. You know, I have to write sincerely about my perspective, and it's limited, and it's what I got. So you write about your perspective sincerely, passionately, and then scholarly. This is key. So you can draw from your clinical experiences, your patient experiences, personal experiences. So we drew from our experiences as national leaders, basically having seen that there really isn't enough student and resident publication in this area. Yes, people think about research, but they think about it in the classic sense, not so much in these types of articles we're talking about today. You could get inspiration from an article you read. You could get an inspiration from a conference lecture. We went to this conference, and I was partly inspired by that setting. And then I just wanted to delineate between letters, reflective essays, and perspective commentaries, which is the terms that academic medicine use. So letters have been covered in a prior webinar. You know, they're very brief. They can be scholarly or they can be narrative. They often respond to certain pieces, but they're very brief. Reflective essays may be what you think of as like a perspective piece. They're more of a narrative writing in the first person usually. They're not strictly scholarly, but they can be published in very high impact journals like JAMA, A Piece of My Mind, or Academic Medicine has Teaching and Learning Moments. These are fantastic opportunities. And I think Jennifer is going to talk more about some of her writing, which I know she's done a lot of reflective writing as well as scholarly writing. Perspectives and commentaries are what Dr. Kumagai was talking about, which are these sort of scholarly analyses that have strong citation support. They're not usually narrative writing, but they draw on personal narratives and personal stories. Next slide, please. So I just kind of put together some do's and don'ts. This is the kind of stuff that I think for students can be helpful. You know, first, identify something that's novel and interesting that probably is going to build on prior work. It's very rare that something has not been talked about ever before. So you got to find something that's has fresh perspective that you can build on. Read the journal review and article criteria. I can't say this enough. See what they're looking for. So you can do this for each journal. This is a tiny URL for academic medicine's article criteria. Read prior perspectives. Choose people to work with that write well, that bring unique perspectives to you, that complement you, that are complementary to you. I would highly recommend outlining pieces to make sure things connect logically before you write. And once you've done those steps, just get started. So many students ask, how do I get started? You just got to start writing. And that's, after that point is when I really call on faculty mentors for peer review and for helps with revision and moving things along. It's a little different than like a research article where you're doing IRB approval. There's a lot of preconception. I really think just getting started with perspective pieces and working on the revision process and honing it is how you make something really sing. And then I'd really recommend working towards a deadline. You know, you can write these things in less than a month. We did it in 2 weeks, a team of 3. You know, don't stretch it out over a year. Just pound something out that speaks to your perspective. Next slide, please. Here's an example structure. Again, they can vary substantially, but I'm just throwing something in. You know, an abstract, they have a kind of standard format in academic medicine, introduction, kind of a prior history, context. Then you kind of discuss your proposal, your perspective, potential solutions. And then there's usually a section at the end, which you can think of as sort of future work, but it's how does that proposal, where does that leave us? What should we do next? Next slide, please. Some components of successful commentaries, I literally read commentaries for like the last, year before I wrote ours just to see what was good. And some of the things I noted was they had catchy titles. So I had not seen Arno's slides, but here's a tiny URL for a one-pager for a section in academic medicine on how to write effective titles. They open strongly, they draw the reader in. They often use we to draw on the writer's own experience, especially as trainees. I would highly recommend this. They acknowledge prior work. They cite it. You're not writing in a vacuum, so don't pretend like you're the first one with ideas. They draw corollaries to non-medical fields, and Dr. Kumagai alluded to this. Quotes, concepts, other, sociology, religion. Those are all fair game, and they really add unique, depth to pieces. They often pose open-ended questions that don't get answered. That's okay. They're written succinctly with very tight language. They have good flow and momentum and energy and verve to the writing. They often provide solutions, or I don't really like the word solutions because I think it's flawed, but often recommendations or next steps. And I think the best ones that I read explicitly state competing perspectives. You know, you're offering your perspective, but just ignoring that there are other perspectives, I think is short-sighted. So those are some components. So that's all I had. I want to leave it plenty of time for Jennifer to talk, and I'd be happy to answer questions at the end more about our piece or other aspects of that. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for this wonderful perspective. I absolutely admire taking your passion on a topic that you really liked and actually going forward, approaching someone in that high rank and, you know, saying, I have something to bring to the table. I think it's really admirable and really inspirational. So thank you so much for your...
Thanks, Lama. And I just wanted to plug, you know, Dr. Sklar, all the folks at Academic Medicine are so warm. The worst case scenario is they're going to say, no. And you're no worse off. So be bold, approach people at conferences, approach your peers and mentors, ask them, hey, what's my next step? You know, I got this idea. How can you help me?
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jesse. We'll move to our last presenter for tonight. So Jennifer, she is Miss Jennifer Tai. Officially, she's a fourth-year medical student at Brown University who will be also talking about her perspective piece that she published in Academic Medicine. So without further ado, I leave it to you, Jennifer.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right. Well, first, thank you so much. It's really exciting to be on this, and to echo what was just said, you know, I think my experience publishing with Academic Medicine has been really phenomenal. And, you know, like was mentioned, the worst thing that can happen is they say no. And every interaction I've had with this publication has just been really heartwarming and have felt really valued. So thank you so much again for this opportunity and the work that they're doing. I don't want to repeat too much of what has already been said. I really, really agree with the major points that have mentioned by these two other amazing panelists. Something that, you know, has been mentioned a couple times that I totally agree with is that it's so important to pick a topic that you're passionate about through and through. Be fueled by passion and curiosity to follow that thread and that thought. I think I've seen several times people coming in with this attitude of, you know, I want to publish instead of I want to know, or I want to articulate, or I want to share, or I want to think thoughtfully. And that verbiage really matters. It's going to guide your experience, your authenticity, your voice, and honestly, the quality of the product you produce. And I think following that curiosity is also really important. I think people have mentioned, you know, you need to do the due diligence of knowing what's already out there, what ideas have already been worked up or considered or evaluated. And part of writing a perspective is really doing a good formulation of the state when it comes to whatever topic you're writing on. Doing this sort of literature review and deep dive is necessary so that you can become a sort of expert in the topic. And you can't really become an expert without offering a little bit of elbow grease or sort of perspective or deep thinking. And it really is so much more enjoyable to wade through the existing work of an issue you have an emotional balance towards. It's really hard to do that in a way that's heartfelt and personal and authentic if you're not doing something that speaks to you. So I think I agree with so much of what has been said. And for my little section of today's webinar, what I really wanted to focus on, if I can offer one thing and piece of advice, is just a really deep encouragement and reminder to tell yourself that this is something that you can do. It's so helpful to have learned a little bit about structure and this kind of brief survey into what goes into different kinds of writing and how to target different publications. I certainly have been taking notes throughout this webinar for myself as well. But when I think back to my experience in starting to write, both in terms of perspective publications like this, but also, reflective essays or, op-eds, one of the biggest obstacles that I had to overcome, and one that I can hope we can remind our listeners today, is that you are perfectly capable of writing a perspective. You have the ability, you have the brains, you have the passion, and you have the expertise to do this if you want to. I think as a first-year medical student, I really did not have it even as a thought to consider myself as somebody who could write a perspective or publish an op-ed. And the fact that there are students and residents listening to this and preparing to do this speaks volumes to your commitment and forethought, which is really incredible to see. For me, looking back, I needed someone to tell me that it was possible for me to do this. And I think for so many people, that's a good place to start. It's just reminding myself that you can do this and you deserve to do this. Um, this sort of thought about, trying to do writing and finding your courage or time or a topic. It's important to reflect on this question of, why aren't you writing? Why aren't you pursuing a perspective piece right now? Or what's sort of stopping you? And there are certainly a lot of logistics and concrete structural reasons why that's hard. Medical school and residency certainly have so many responsibilities. There's a need to study and prepare and take care of people, and the hours are long. You need to sleep, you need to take care of yourself. And there are a lot of different sort of shifts that occupy our minds, whether it's the work shift, the health shift, the study shift. I think for me, there was also a sense of an activist shift, wanting to be in the community and doing work directly with people in a way that sometimes felt like writing might not be, where I should be investing my time if what I cared about was community work. And I think what I really found is that writing has been my most important medium for activism, and it certainly has been my most important tool for trying to affect the change, both curricularly and culturally, that I really, really want to see in the institutions that I'm part of. But I also think in talking to people about writing and drawing from my own experiences, one of the biggest reasons people don't write and why I didn't write, or why it took me a very long time to write, is doubt around credibility and confidence. The sense of, why would I write? Why do I deserve to have my thoughts amplified? Why would anyone believe that I'm an expert when there are thousands of more qualified people out there, experts who can speak on and write about this with infinitely more grace and wisdom than I can. And I think this is something that especially affects women and people of color. It's backed up by evidence. Studies from 2008 and 2012 finding that 97% of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal were written by men. In the Washington Post, less than 1% or less than 0.5% of op-eds being written by Latino individuals, an average of 2% written by Asian Americans, roughly 5% by African Americans. I think it was stunning that some of the data shows that commentaries on women's issues, only 53% of those are written by women. And these numbers sort of go on and on. You could spend an entire webinar talking about just that, or going over the data on just that. But I think what's really important is to remember that whoever tells these stories writes history, and engaging in perspectives and commentary writing, you are creating knowledge, you are creating the conversation. And it's exactly because of that that we need a diverse set of voices. I think it's so important to consider and imagine and work towards the world that would exist if we invested more in the brain power and set of voices that are missing from our epistemologies. So this is something that I say with a lot of conviction and a lot of heart. I really never thought this was something I could do. And honestly, beyond the writing and the research required to publish, the perspective piece that I did, what I kind of needed was permission. I needed somebody to tell me that I had something to say and it was worthwhile and I could. And so I would really like to take this opportunity to offer that to the people listening here that you do have this potential, you do have the expertise, and that your voice really does matter. The voices of students, trainees, especially, you know, people who have perspectives that are often missing and not immediately rewarded or not seen as valued or commonly throughout the publications that we read. That's what we need. And so if there's one big takeaway, that's really what I want to say. So I, you know, can offer other details on, you know, the more concrete aspects of how I wrote, you know, the perspective piece, along with some incredible peers. It certainly wasn't just me, but maybe if those questions come up in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more, but I just really wanted to take the opportunity.
So much, Jenny, for this inspiration for the people on this webinar. We certainly needed to hear it, because oftentimes we forget that our voices are actually recruited. People want to hear from trainees because they offer such a different and unique perspective that is really important for us. So in this section, I would like to invite the participants to type in the comments below any questions that they have for our panelists. And I would like to again thank all the panelists for their hard work and really extraordinary and inspirational talks. We really learned a lot about perspective, commentary, but also about the process of writing in general, and writing in medical education and academia particularly. So I would invite all the participants to post their questions, but we also have some questions that we took from your RSVPs. So I would like to start by asking the first question, and that would be, how do you find mentors to mentor your writing? And that can go to either Dr. Kumagai or Jessie or Jenny. How did you go about to pick your mentor?
I think Lama, sorry, Kumagai, I think that's actually one of the most challenging aspects of this area. Because in medicine, right, the type of writing we're talking about, when we're writing about commentaries, or the type of really, you know, compelling and brilliant writing that Jenny has described in her piece on race and preclinical education, that's a very different type of writing you'd find, you know, when we're flooded by articles on, you know, heart failure and diabetes and things. And that's not to mean that the other stuff isn't any good. Of course, it's important. It's incredibly important, but it's a different type of writing. So what I guess the way I approach that is usually, I mean, you know, and for years I didn't have a really good mentor. In fact, I had no mentor, and I just really had to kind of rely on my own wits. But to ask around the you know, the school, the institution, look nationally. If you're interested in this type of writing, think about certain organizations in the health humanities or medical humanities. Look out, you know, ask people who, you know, who does a lot of op-ed stuff, who does a lot of commentaries. And that's another way. I mean, for instance, Jenny, you're at Brown, and there's a guy named Jay Baruch, B-A-R-U-C-H.
Mm-hmm.
He's in emergency medicine, and he's an amazing writer. I mean, he writes short stories, he writes commentary, he writes about art and medicine. You know, a wonderful, brilliant guy who's incredibly humble and incredibly nice. You know, so just asking around, and it's really using networks, and, you know, let us know, and we can try to direct you as well. I'm sure Dr. Sanchez and Lama know people as well who do this kind of work.
Absolutely. And one thing I would always like to add is if one mentor that you usually go to really doesn't have this expertise in what you're trying to publish, they almost always will refer you to someone that they trust and that has published in what you're trying to accomplish. So it never harms us to ask. Thank you so much, Jessie. The next question, I think Dr. Kumagai or Dr. Sanchez can comment on this, and it says, can you address the concern that expressing an unpopular opinion or perspective can limit our chances of residency matching or employment?
JP, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah,
I think
great
that's
question.
always a consideration for you to think about when writing anything, whether it's writing for a article to be submitted to a peer-reviewed journal, whether you're writing something for a blog, whether you're writing something on Facebook or some other social media platform. So I believe everyone on this call are within the area of medicine, and there is a conservative element of medicine. And I think that ties to wanting to create a space that is safe, that does no harm to anyone and everyone. So, although we aim for that, sometimes we miss the picture with certain groups. But I think that's always something you should be mindful of. Once you put certain words out there on paper, it lives on. And it does characterize who you are. And so, you know, the benefit of sharing it with a senior mentor, of sharing it with other people who can review it, is so that they can give you a perspective of how other people may view it. And whether what you're trying to convey is being conveyed content-wise, but more importantly, tone, in a tone where people will be receptive and not turned away. So I think one thing, as you're considering this question, take note by what the speakers mentioned. Find a writing mentor who can help you deal with difficult questions like this and give you pause of maybe what adjectives, verbs, adverbs you're using so that you could write something that people are receptive to rather turned off to.
I think to echo Dr. Sanchez's point, I think that's really true. I was faced with this as a faculty member when students came up to me, and this is really 10 years ago and before then, and I think the climate has changed to a certain degree since then, but a lot of students would come up and say, well, you know, I'm really active in the LGBT group, and I don't know if I should actually list that as part of my activities on my applications for residency, or I published. There was one student who was just amazing in Michigan, and she had assumed a nationally prominent, extremely prominent role in LGBTQ studies and activism, and it published some really important things. And even she asked me, and you know, my response was, if the writing is rigorous, and if it's good, and if it's thoughtful, then if it comes from a very conservative viewpoint or a very progressive viewpoint, or a very radical viewpoint, if it's really thoughtful and well done, then it'll be accepted as scholarship. If it's a screed, if it's just a rant, then that's where you're going to get a lot of opposition. But I think by and large, people appreciate the fact that people can do really high quality academic work. This brings up actually something else that Jenny had mentioned that made me think. You know, oftentimes, I mean, in terms of inspiration for writing, oftentimes it comes from things that we see in medicine that we really aren't comfortable with. So, for instance, that piece I was telling you that I first started out, that I wrote out, it was actually about my level of discomfort with the term cultural competence. I hated that term because oftentimes the way it would be translated is a list of characteristics of interesting people who didn't look like you, and you had to memorize those characteristics. So when you saw somebody like that, you would apply them, right? It's just stereotyping. And I was really uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable with that, and that's the way it was being taught, that I sat down and I wrote this other piece saying there must be another way of looking at it. And I think in many of the same ways, many of the same kind of a level of dissatisfaction that we may have may be inspirations for writing about things that actually have a huge impact. So, you know, I think you can write about these things, and they can be contentious issues, but if you do it thoughtfully and intelligently and grounded, then I think it's actually a contribution that will be recognized as such.
Thank you so much.
I don't want to belabor this too much, but I just want to jump in, having just recently gone through the residency application process. and just wanted to say, for every one person that would turn it, is conservative, and you're writing about a progressive issue is usually the way it'll go. There's 10 others who are going to just want to eat that up and get you in their residency. And to be honest, you don't want to go to the residency program that doesn't want that kind of writing and that doesn't want what you're offering. You own who you are, and you want to go to a residency program that wants that. And I would tell you there are residency programs who want that, who want LGBT, who want underrepresented minorities, who are bright and are motivated and are passionate. So I just think, own who you are. And again, writing, it has to be scholarly to get into these journals or to get into, New York Times or wherever. It's gonna meet the bar for what's acceptable. If a program doesn't like what you've written, then you don't want to be with that program. That's just my pitch, but yeah.
Absolutely. Finding a perfect fit for residency is something really important. Thank you, Jesse, for that. And then we'll take one more question. How do you correctly reference and cite government policies? Any suggestions for discussing specific government policies that may have heightened political focus, or citations in general for our pieces?
This is Arna Kubia. My advice is, this sounds kind of weird, but go make friends with a librarian in terms of citations and how every journal has its own citation criteria. But in terms of citations, the information specialists are really the experts at this. But, so you can write around policy, but then how it's actually kind of embedded in the piece in a scholarly way is really an area that information specialists are really good at. So I use them all. And I'll oftentimes go up and say, look, I've done this search say on empathy, and I'll try to, I've looked at all of these different databases. Are there any others that you might suggest? And and there are specialists within library and science, and they can tell you which ones you've missed. So those are just some ideas.
Absolutely. I think we always almost forget that the library still is a place that exists beyond just the desk that we could just sit at and study, and the librarian is just a wonderful, wonderful resource that are here to help us. So thank you so much, Dr. Kumagai. That was definitely a great advice. So if there's no more questions in the comments, I think we would like to wrap up. I would like to thank again all of our panelists and participants tonight. I think we had a really informative session. I personally learned a lot about writing perspective commentaries, but also took a great deal of inspiration in terms of what I could be doing and how I could turn really my passion into scholarship. And I hope that that was a common theme that participants have took from this webinar. So thank you so much. If there's any questions, we will be posting this webinar as a video on YouTube, as with our other webinars. And if there's any comments, feedback, or question, you can go ahead and email us at the BNGAP email, and we look forward to seeing you again on further webinars. So thank you so much, and a virtual round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.